Thank you for joining Wars of the Roses. As we continue with Part 9, The Castrators of Russia, from A History of Secret Societies, by Arkon Daraul. Chapter 8, The Castrators of Russia. Quite one of the most extreme secret cults of recent time is the Skoptsi, Castrated, of Russia and the Balkans. The fact that they carried out castration as a part of their religious rites caused them to be considered to be insane, but, as one recent psychologist has pointed out, the movement spread in so many directions, numbered so many thousands of people, and continued for so long that it cannot be regarded but as a psychological state which fulfilled some sort of deep inner need. This need, it is true, might have been implanted by suggestion. Mad fanatics there were within their ranks, from the Caucasus to Hungary. But the Skoptsi reckon among their members men of comparative culture and position, as a bewildered contemporary writer puts it. Although given a Christian framework, the cult of the castrated and castrators was descended from ideas found in the old mystery religions. Ascetics, monks and saints felt that they could attain affinity with the divine through self-mortification. Worshippers of classical mother goddesses, and particularly their priests, celebrated their devotion by the sacrifice of their genitalia. Although it is widely assumed that debauches accompanied the celebration of mystic rites among the ancients, in which indiscriminate sexual relations played a large part, there is considerable evidence to show that, at least in many forms of the fertility cult, it was the suppression of the mating urge, or its diversion into ecstatic channels, which was sought. This seems to be what the castrators did. Skoptsism, in its modern form, started about 1757 among members of the sect of the Flagellants, the people who lashed and mutilated themselves as a means to attain a state of excitement and coma, which is to be found in religious and secret sects throughout the world. Although debauches of self-inflicted wounding were going on in almost epidemic fashion, the Russian government heard officially of the secret sect only in 1771. Rasputin, the mad mystic of Russia, was a flagellant. Their ceremonies are touched upon by Prince Yusupov thus: they claim to be inspired with the Word and to incarnate Christ, a monstrous combination of the Christian religion with pagan rites and primitive superstitions. The purpose of these radni, or ceremonies, was to create a religious ecstasy, an erotic frenzy. After invocations and hymns, the faithful formed a ring and began to sway in rhythm, and then to whirl round and round, spinning faster and faster. The master of ceremonies flogged any dancer whose vigor abated. The radeni ended in a horrible orgy, everyone rolling on the ground in ecstasy or in convulsions. A peasant called Andrei Ivanov was arrested, tried and convicted of having induced 13 other peasants to mutilate themselves. In this act, accompanied by orgies of singing and dancing, he was helped by one Kondraty Selivanov, a peasant of Stolbovo in the province of Orel. The legal investigation took place in St. Petersburg, during which there was considerable popular incredulity that people could act thus without apparent reason. The baffled court sentenced Ivanov to the knout. He was then exiled to Siberia and is thought to have died there. But Selivanov was still at liberty. Fleeing to the district of Tambov, he started to preach the doctrine that salvation and fulfillment came only through the supreme sacrifice, the baptism of fire. He soon attracted a disciple, Alexander Ivanov Shilov, and made many converts. The members met regularly, worked themselves up into a wild and uncontrollable frenzy, and encouraged each other to self-mutilation. In 1775, the revered leader, by now plump and facially hairless, the consequences of his eunuchry, was in Moscow itself, preaching his doctrine and enrolling disciples. Seized in Moscow, he was given a taste of the knout and sent to Siberia, from which he was soon to escape. Several of his followers were beaten judicially, then sent to penal servitude in the fortress of Dortmund. Others who had not yet committed the sacrifice were warned and forbidden to preach the cult. But the movement spread to the utter bewilderment of the state. In 1797, Selivanov appeared again in Moscow, where the emperor, intrigued by such an aberration, gave him an audience and sent him to a madhouse. The accession of Alexander I, a mystical-minded Tsar, gave Selivanov his chance. Alexander was dominated by a strange woman who believed in magic and thought that Selivanov was a saint. This Baroness Krudner arranged for him to be released from the asylum and gave him the entree to aristocratic circles. House after noble house was opened to him and filled with his enthusiastic disciples of all ranks. He numbered among his followers one extremely powerful figure who early helped him and the other Skoptsi in every way, State Councillor Alexei Mikolov-Jelansky, a secret member of the cult, himself castrated and also a castrator of new recruits. Selivanov was before long set up in a splendid house by his disciples. They contributed towards his upkeep, worked ceaselessly to increase the membership among influential people, and indulged in ceremonies which they believed gave them joy in this life and entry to the next on their own terms. The master's home was called the House of God, or sometimes Heavenly Zion. Sometimes again it was referred to as the New Jerusalem. Selivanov was a reincarnation of Christ, who was himself the embodiment of an earlier, undefined deity. His transmigration was not direct, having been through the body of Peter III, who had been born, they claimed, of the Immaculate Virgin Elizabeth Petrovna. This empress ruled in actuality, it is said, for 2 years only. After this she transferred her power to a woman of the court who resembled her. Changing her name to Akulina Ivanovna, she dedicated herself to the cult. She lived at first at the house of the Skoptsi prophet Philemon. Prophets were those who had induced 12 people to castrate themselves in the province of Orel. Then she moved to a sanctuary behind a wall where she was worshipped by the faithful until 1865. Secret reports state that she was believed to be able to transfer her divine powers to a selected person when on the point of death, thus keeping up the ability to give the Skoptsi their hallucinatory experiences of divine kinship. The supposed history of Selivanov is no less unusual. He was born, says the legend, in Holstein, and as soon as he reached manhood, he castrated himself utterly and convinced many others that this was the way to salvation. He was helped in this, if we are to believe the story, because he was able to perform miracles, which he said was only because he had made the sacrifice. Inheriting the throne as Peter III, he was compelled to marry. His bride, Catherine II, soon felt that his deficiencies were such that she must have him removed by assassination. The emperor, however, was warned in time. He changed clothes with a sentry who was killed in his place. He later took the form of the peasant Selivanov. Meanwhile, the empress learned of the facts, but it suited her plans to have it thought that she was a widow. The soldier was buried with full imperial honors. Disciples pointed to Selivanov's undoubted popularity with people of quality as one indication of his former life. Shilov, the believers asserted, was the forerunner and merely the announcer of the Redeemer Selivanov, the Book of the Passion of Selivanov. The Redeemer tells how Emperor Paul I had Selivanov brought back to metropolitan Russia to hand him his crown, as he recognized him as his father, but this was not possible because Selivanov, of course, demanded that Paul be castrated in order to become a proper member of the true faith. As a result, Selivanov was imprisoned by the perverse Paul, who valued his genitals more than his Redeemer. It is further claimed that when Alexander came to the throne and had the mystic released, he also joined the sect and induced his wife to do likewise. Certain it is that Selivanov was protected at court, and it was only the government which considered him a threat to public safety. Selivanov, when the government decided to confine him to the monastery of Suzdal, gave out that he would live forever, and this belief continued long after his death. It is said that the legend is still believed. In due course, he will reappear and take control of all Russia, and everyone will be castrated. Present-day followers of the cult, at least until recently in the Balkans and currently quite secretly in the Lebanon and Turkey, have modified the teachings. Each member is allowed to have 2 children, after which he must be castrated and can fulfill himself in the way which the sect insists was his destiny. The reason for the castrators revering Peter III is that it was this Tsar who removed the ordinances against the flagellants and treated them kindly. He actually was the son of the Duke of Holstein. There is no reason to believe that Akulina Ivanovna was, in fact, the Empress Elizabeth. It was stated by the police authorities that she was born into the peasantry in the province of Tambov, and her real name was Karasanova. Selivanov died in 1832 at a very advanced age in the monastery of Spaso-Euphemius. One of his most fanatical lieutenants, Captain Sosonovich, was placed in another monastery, where he was reconverted to Orthodox Christianity and revealed the innermost secrets of the cult to the abbot. The cult showed a remarkable propensity for spreading. A Russian doctor who prepared maps of its diffusion taken from the accounts of people who had been caught and tried during a succession of cases in the early 19th century showed that up to 1839 the cult had centers in most Russian provinces. These, of course, embraced people of several different races and temperaments. Great concentrations of the people of God existed as far apart as St. Petersburg, the Black Sea area, and the borders of the White Sea. Even by 1822, the spread had been extraordinary. Most of the gold and silver smiths of the capital belonged to it, and the Crimea was thoroughly infiltrated with the doctrine. In the middle of the 19th century, the Emperor Nicholas took severe measures against Skoptsism. Hundreds were caught and sent to Siberia, but this seemed only to increase the epidemic. The Balkans became a seat of propaganda, and more orgies of self-mutilation were reported. Whole guilds of traders, hackney carriage drivers, carpenters and builders, were reputed to be infected. Following a decline in activity, which was wrongly thought to spell the beginning of the end, the cult burst out with renewed fury in the 1870s. The Skoptsi had something to communicate, they had to have recruits, but they were also a secret society, and this combination has led to an interesting reflection about them. More than one theorist claims that there was a secret which was confided to the members only after they had been castrated. By making a sacrifice of this magnitude, the member would not only be proved to be worthy, he would not have very much to go back to if he were to revert. The secret, according to a confession of one who is referred to as a Skopez who had gone mad, was the means whereby one man or woman can gain absolute power over another and appear to cause miracles. The inner teaching, said a young man who heard such things discussed by his parents when he was almost in his cradle and who escaped before puberty to avoid the enthusiastic attentions of his nearest and dearest, was that a man can have the power of a god. This power is immensely greater and more fulfilling than obeying the dictates of fate in a procreative activity which has been imposed upon one. Only by sacrificing the organ of such indulgence could a person cultivate the taste for greater real power. They would, at first, only admit Russians to the sect, a barrier which was removed in 1902. Writing of this restriction in 1874, one disgusted commentator asks, "Is it that they can, in no other nationality, find people mad enough to submit to their rites?" Nothing seemed to stop the enthusiasm, the visions, the immense vigor of the castrators. In 1865, the inhabitants of an area bordering the Sea of Azov complained to the Russian government that the sect was spreading daily. Mutilated men and women in their hundreds were found by police investigators. The cult here seemed to center around a prophetess, a peasant woman by the name of Babanin, who was believed to have the power to cure all ills by the touch, to speak with the voices of the dead who resided within her, and to be able to procure favors for anyone in any part of Russia through telepathic hypnotism. All these beliefs, of course, were attributed to the new power which she had obtained by embracing the creed and suffering an operation in accordance with its rules. She and a number of her followers were banished to Siberia. Soon, however, it was found that her community was but a branch of a greater center. The town of Morkansk in the province of Tambov was witnessing remarkable scenes of mass and instant conversion, hallucinations, and the ever-growing power of the sinister Skoptsi. On the last night of the year, 1869, the chief of police of the town was at a party. About midnight, he was called out of the room and handed a letter by a servant of an important merchant, asking for the release of 3 women of the sect who were in custody. They would be returned to their prison in the morning. 10,000 rubles in cash were enclosed with the letter. The matter was immediately turned over to the Criminal Investigation Department. The merchant, one Plotikin, was arrested on an attempted bribery charge and his house searched. His home was found to consist of a cluster of houses built over 4 immense underground cellars. From these vaults, a huge amount of treasure in gold and banknotes was unearthed. But the damning evidence was an extensive correspondence with numerous wealthy merchants in various parts of Russia, including a well-known St. Petersburg millionaire. The letters showed that all were members of the cult and were engaged in activities ranging from increasing their influence through bribery and recruitment to preparing for the overthrow of the state. People interviewed stated that the reason for asking for the temporary release of the 3 women cultists was that they were needed to help to produce the ritual ecstasy which the sect was indulging in. It was believed that by using some of the prisoners in their rites, they would all be enabled to go free in some magical manner. This, of course, is nothing less than the principle of sympathetic magic, like effects like. Going on this assumption, they would have made use of policemen and jailers too, if they could get hold of them, to bring this element into the magical activities. Plotkin was deprived of his dignities and his civil rights and banished to Siberia, along with 12 other men and 19 women members of the movement. The correspondence and plots discovered led now to the attempted uprooting of the Skoptsi in other parts of the Russian Empire. Nearly 2 years were occupied with the trials of the accused, high and low, who were daily being discovered. Such horrors were revealed and such important people implicated that it was forbidden to publish further details of the cases. The purpose of the uprooting of the sect was officially looked upon as a matter of internal security rather than religious discipline. Thus it is that we hear little of torture being applied to obtain confessions or reversal to the original faith. But documents and confessions elicited by whatever means give a fair picture of the official beliefs and method of worship of the Skoptsi. The baptism of fire was stated to be the way to eternal salvation, and it was also referred to as the seal of God. The Great Seal was the euphemism for the removal of the entire organ, and this was considered to be the highest form of dedication. The lesser seal was ordinary castration. Normal marital relations between man and woman were considered sinful. Parents, in giving life to their children, committed a very mortal sin. This was the reason given for making the neophyte, before initiation, write the names of his progenitors on paper and trample them underfoot. It should be mentioned, however, that this practice was claimed by the members of some communities to be a symbolic one, in which the candidate formally indicated his severance from worldly ties. Variations, as already noted, allowed 2 children to be born before initiation, and it is reported that only 1 child was allowed in some groups of the order. In a typical Saturday night Skoptsi religious ceremony, men and women were led in the singing of hymns by 1 or more prophets. These songs were often composed of apparently barbarous words, and the compelling rhythm of the tunes seems to have been the main instrument of producing frenzy. During the singing, one or other of the leaders present would apparently pass into some form of trance and give out orders and prophecies to all and sundry. These ejaculations were carefully written down and abided by, if at all possible. The final part of the proceedings was the frenzied dancing, which was carried out in such a violent manner as to give the impression that the dancer was possessed by spirits. The dance most often used resembled shamanistic displays among the Mongols. The arms were held outwards from the sides and moved up and down to the beat of a small drum. Then, with the body twitching as if it wanted involuntarily to step forward, the dancer would put his left foot forward by 2 jerky steps, followed by the right. The music varied from a really thundering rhythm on percussion instruments to a form of dance which seemed to resemble the waltz step of later days. Sometimes the dancers, in imitation of one of their leaders, would mimic frenziedly his or her hand gestures, something like a team of athletes doing calisthenics. The initiation of a new entrant does not follow this pattern at all, oddly enough. It might be expected that recruitment would take place after participation in an orgy, such as has been described. But in the case of the Skoptsi, it was the individual who was first worked up to a stage of piety, excitement, a consciousness of sin, and a desire to participate in the activities of the group, which seemed to him to have so much power and mystery. It might almost be said that the instructor, once he had found a victim, conditioned him by remaining, as it were, 1 step behind him in his mounting excitement and desire to join a privileged class. In the final vow before the ritual of castration, the victim promised, of his own free will, to come to the Redeemer and to keep secret from the emperor, princes, parents, relatives and friends, everything that is connected with these holy affairs, to submit to persecution, torture, fire and even death, before revealing any part of the mysteries to enemies. The Skoptsi built their meeting places with some care in order to preserve themselves from intrusion. They claimed, of course, that the plan of the buildings and the method of their arrangement were essential to the production of the power which they were using. The general pattern was a room built as far as possible from any other dwelling house, though surrounded by barns and other buildings, either in the middle of this enclosure, where there was a courtyard, or within the room itself the orgies were held. There were always a number of secret doors which led into fields, and each member knew which was his own emergency exit. This provided against congestion in the case of attack, and the probability that some, at least, of the worshippers might escape. In escaping, the senior members would pass through a bee house, placed there to discourage the attentions of any party investing the premises. There was a special garb worn for the devotions. The men wore long white, wide shirts closed at the neck and with long sleeves, of quite an oriental pattern. A girdle was tied around the waist and large baggy trousers completed the outfit. The women wear blue gowns of nankeen. In the towns of chintz, they moreover cover their heads with white cloths. All wore white stockings at times, and at other times were said to be barefooted. In their hands were white handkerchiefs, which they called flags. Members not yet castrated are termed donkeys or goats, while the others are white lambs or doves. In order to absorb a part of the divinity of the renowned Shilov, small pieces of bread were eaten, which had been placed in holes of a monument which had been erected to him. It was claimed by a priest, a spy who cultivated certain Skoptsi leaders on church orders, that there was a communion of flesh and blood. This possibly fictitious practice was said to take the particularly obnoxious form of cannibalism which could be expected among a community with castration tenets. Castration is called the baptism of fire by the sect because, according to their beliefs, it was originally carried out with a red-hot iron. Because of human weakness, this was amended to allow a sharp knife to be employed. Christ, they hold, and the early Christians all practiced it. It seems, however, that it is the act, rather than the instrument with, is all important. This is borne out by statistics published by the authorities, as follows. The exact location of the operation varied a good deal. In 620 cases investigated by the police, 96 were carried out in houses, 19 castrations in prisons, 41 in baths, 32 in barns, 6 in cellars, 136 in woods, 223 on roads and in fields, and so on. If the authorities were unable to account for the strange beliefs and practices of the Skoptsi, they were at least going to comply with filling in the appropriate form under where the offence was committed. Women members were almost as fanatical as men, 40% as fanatical, that is to say. Within them, we are informed, the operation is as fearful as it is revolting, and yet we find women among the operators. Among 43 peasant women who acted in this capacity, 5 had actually operated upon men. 4 members in 10 were females, on average. The Skoptsi cast their net wide in search of converts, and in 1815 it was remarked that if the numbers of their aristocratic adherents were small compared to the peasants within their ranks, this was merely because in Russia most people were peasants. One report states that their numbers, in the matter of proportions of peasants to people of quality, approximate to the usual relationship of numbers in terms of rank. A sampling by class is still extant. 4 ladies and 4 gentlemen of the nobility, 10 military and 5 naval officers, 14 civil servants, 19 priests, 148 merchants, 220 citizens, 2,736 peasants, of whom 827 were women, 119 landowners, 443 soldiers and soldiers' wives and daughters. The attempts at suppression of the sect served in many cases only to increase its power, a fact which had been foreseen and was actively canvassed by the members. Skoptsi, who had been placed in the care of monks, converted whole monasteries to their teachings in spite of the horror with which they had been viewed on entry. The unpopularity of the clergy and the police actually provided a large number of cases of emulation on the part of individuals who wanted to share their fate. Observers were convinced that the only way to stop the spread of the cult was to deport its members to unpopulated places and leave them there to die out. Another obstacle to the crushing of the movement, much noted during the beginning of the 20th century, was the fact that the Skoptsi endowed churches paid large sums of money to priests and officials and generally became looked upon as benefactors by large numbers of people who were thus prevented from doing their duty to protect society against them. Secret ciphers. The riddle of the power of the Skoptsi has had some light thrown upon it by more recent psychological research. Noting that the active emasculation and self-mutilation is a very old form of religious activity, Dr. K. A. Menninger, Man Against Himself, London, 1938, believes that this cult and others like it originated with a self-destructive urge which can be found or developed in many people. It is related, he thinks, in common with many other psychological thinkers, to all forms of self-mortification, whether done in the name of religion or otherwise. There are to this day people in many parts of the world who will claim that self-mutilation is but a step to the attainment of mystical insight. That it is associated with the idea of sacrifice seems in no doubt at all. What is still in dispute is whether all forms of self-mortification are merely mental states, or whether there is in fact some inner resource which can be tapped by these means. Few people would go to the irremediable lengths of the Skoptsi in order to find out. The methods employed with such success in mass conversions by the Skoptsi may depend upon the existence of teachers fanatical enough to drive home a dominant idea into the minds of suggestible people. If this is so, and there's no secret knowledge such as has been hinted at in Skoptsi confessions, it is unlikely that the cult will have as startling a future as its past. In Soviet periodicals, references to the survival of the sect continue, as in material coming from Romania, where descendants of early refugees are to be found. Figure E, Skoptsi cult. 1. Initiates mark. 2. Danger signal. 3. Members house mark. Thank you for watching, and please don't forget to share, like, subscribe and comment, and if you can, please consider donating to Wars of the Roses. Links to PayPal and Patreon are in the description. Thank you so very much.